And joining us now on the debate in Edmonton, Alberta, Graham Thompson, political columnist with the Edmonton Journal. In Calgary, Alberta, Janet Brown, pollster with Janet Brown Consulting. Dwayne Bratt, chair and professor in the Department of Policy Studies at Mount Royal University. And David Yeager, Wild Rose Party candidate in the riding of Calgary-Hawkwood. And with us here in studio in Toronto, Jerry Nichols, independent communications and political consultant. And we're happy, Jerry, to have you back in that chair there. And to our four guests in Points Beyond, happy to have you on our program today, too. Let me start by just sharing with our viewers Alberta by the numbers. Population of Alberta now cruising towards 4 million people almost. The GDP of the province, $263.5 billion. Energy revenues, $73 billion plus. That's about a quarter of Alberta's GDP. The unemployment rate, less than 5%, well below the national average. However, there is a deficit in this petro province of $3.1 billion. Now, Michael Smith, let's put up the next graphic as well, which is a look at the 5 faces of the 5 major party leaders in the province of Alberta. And if that doesn't look like a typical province in typical Canada, it doesn't. So let's get into this. Graham Thompson, start us off. How different is the face, if you like, of Alberta's political landscape today compared to, say, just 5 years ago?
Well, I think it has changed, at least in the surface. You've got the mayor of Calgary, of course, you referred to. Then she was elected as mayor of Calgary. He's a visible minority, he's a Muslim, but he wasn't elected because of that. And I think that in some ways there was a line from the premier when Alison Redford won as leader of the PC Party. She said that Alberta politics is now catching up with the rest of the province, and that's true. I think that Alberta is not this ideological right-wing redneck province. In fact, it's very progressive, very urban, and I think that we are seeing politics start to reflect that more and more, which is why we see at the civic level more small L liberals are getting elected and people like that. So I think that this is reflected in the politics. The premier, Alison Redford, is making a real point of targeting progressives. She did that to win the leadership of her party last year. She didn't go after a typical conservative. She went after the soccer moms, the teachers, the nurses. And she is saying that the province is very progressive, very moderate, and she's going after that because that tends to reflect Alberta more than the old-style redneck Tory.
Okay, Janet Brown, then, in which case do you think Premier Redford's appeal is more, say, on the progressive side of things than the conservative side of things?
Well, I think that's the balance that she has to strike. She talked a lot about being progressive in the campaign, in the leadership campaign, trying to appeal to those voters who maybe are feeling sort of left out of the mix. There's been so much talk about the Wild Rose, so much talk about Alberta moving politically to the right, that in the leadership she did talk a lot about, you know, progressive voters and making sure that they still felt comfortable in the Progressive Conservative Party. One
of her strengths, David Yeager, obviously, is that she came out of nowhere to win this thing. What do you see, given that you're going to be running against her soon, as some of her weaknesses?
I think it's the 40-year-old party. I think you're packing a lot of baggage. Preston Manning at one point commented on how political parties just wear out, and he learned that from his father. And he said something to the effect, and I loved it. He says, my father found himself talking people into things he'd talked them out of before, and he'd talked them out of things he'd talked them into in the past. And so however much change Alison Redford or how much progression she's trying to reflect, this is a party that does have 40 years of history and a lot of baggage. And that's why I'm here today doing what I'm doing.
Dwayne Bratt, we did see in the province of Ontario that after 42 straight years of Conservative government, you know, there was a dynamic that took place in which people said, okay, we've had enough of that. How much of that is a concern for Premier Redford, do you suppose, at the moment?
She has to be concerned largely to the rise of the Wild Rose Alliance party, which was nowhere on the radar screen, you know, 4 years ago. Elected someone in a by-election, is doing well, relatively well in the polls, has attracted 3 people to cross the floor. At the same time, the PCs in Alberta have been very good at reinventing themselves. They were in trouble at the end of the Getty years, and they reinvented themselves under Ralph Klein as a much more conservative party, and he kept power for 14 years. Now they're reinventing themselves a bit more on the progressive centrist side under Alison Redford. So the PC party has been very good at moving around. We're seeing a lot of the old guard leaving, and we'll have to see how the electorate handles this new PC party, or whether they see them as simply the continuation of 40 years rule.
Jerry, I guess we should just remind everybody, Alison Redford won the premiership on the basis of her winning the PC Party leadership after Premier Ed Stelmach stepped down.
Right.
But on the other side of things, the Wild Rose Party, do they have appeal, do you believe, beyond the small C Conservative base to which they obviously appeal?
Oh, I think they absolutely can have broaden their appeal. Right now, they're an ideologically conservative party, and I think what the other people say are absolutely right. What impresses me or interests me about Redford's strategy is she's embracing the red Tory label. She's not fighting it, she's embracing it. So I think she's trying to put together a coalition of Liberals and NDPers and moderate Tories to be her base. To counteract that, what I think the Canadian Alliance has to do, is, or the Wild Rose Party has to do, is three things. First of all, they have to, I think, remind people, as somebody else said, it's time for change. 42 years is a long time to be in power. They're getting out of touch. We need new leaders, we need new voices, etc. I think the second thing is they have to find something on their agenda, on their Conservative agenda, that will resonate with mainstream Alberta voters. That's extremely key. And I think the last thing they have to do, and this might be a little bit controversial, I think they have to degrade Alison Redford's brand a little bit with some kind of air war over the next few months or weeks. If they do those things, I think they can sort of re-energize their base, re-energize their supporters, and reach out to enough mainstream Alberta Tories that they can win the election.
Well, let's see if this does the job. You want to see the Wild Rose ad?
Sure.
Here's something they're running against Alison Redford. Go ahead, Michael. Roll tape, please.
Alison Redford promised change like fixed election dates. Now she won't say when the next election will be. She promised openness, but then tried closing the legislature. Is this the kind of change Albertans want?
Hi, I'm Danielle Smith. Albertans are tired of politicians who will do anything for power. The Wild Rose believes that leaders need to stand up for what's right, even when it's tough. Integrity. It's the Alberta way.
Danielle Smith, the right kind of change.
Graham, you want to judge the effectiveness of that ad?
Yeah, I think that was the ad that they ran right after Redford became leader of the PCs, and it was seen to be a bit of an attack ad too soon, way too quick. I think it did backfire against the Wild Rose, and they tended to back off their attacks against Redford. See, the person that the Wild Rose ideally wants to take on is Ed Stelmach, the previous premier. Mm-hmm. He was unpopular. He brought in the royalty rate regime. He began raising taxes on oil and gas companies. That became very unpopular when the price of oil and gas collapsed, and we saw the 2008 meltdown in the economy. So the Wild Rose was doing really well when they had Ed Stelmach to run against. And now that Ed Stelmach has stepped down and been replaced by Alison Redford, things have changed all of a sudden in Alberta politics. Redford is a lot more popular than Stelmach ever was. She's very articulate, and it seems that they don't have the same kind of target to take on. A lot's going to depend as well on the economy. If the economy recovers this year, that's going to help the Tories tremendously. The Tories always tend to do much better when the economy is doing better, like any political party. And I think that if we start seeing the deficit decrease, it's even more news, good news. If, though, we see the economy start to turn, the deficit rise in Alberta, then Albertans tend to get more frustrated and have less time for their politicians in power. But right now, it seems that the person who is the target of the Wild Rose attacks is handling the attacks very, very well, and it doesn't seem to be affecting her. The public opinion polls are showing the Tories well ahead of the Wild Rose.
Well, I'm going to get to the polls in a second because they're saying a couple of different things. But Janet Brown, let me try this with you. I don't know how much of the consulting you do is on image consulting, but when Premier Redford just did her interview with us, the Conservative Premier of Alberta was dressed top to bottom in red. What is she trying to say by... I come from the school of thought where none of these things is done by accident. So what's she trying to say by doing that?
I think she's trying to speak to those Albertans who could care less about the political spectrum, those Albertans who don't even really know what it means to be on the left versus the right. I think, as Graham said earlier, she's talking to soccer moms. She's talking to average Albertans about their concerns, health, education, whatever. I think somebody probably told her she looked good in red, and I think she's trying to sort of neutralize all these traditional political symbols of red and blue and orange and yellow and green and left and right. And I think she's really just trying to speak to people on an individual level.
David Yeager, if that ends up broadening her base, that's tough for you guys, isn't it?
Well, I should explain where I came from. I'm an oil service executive who basically had to lay off 300 people in 2009 to get through the year when the new royalty framework was in effect. And that was a time when the government of Alberta, first of all, didn't deny that there was a problem, gave themselves a raise. So I just figured that these people, and perhaps it was under Stelmach, as Graham Thompson has pointed out, but the fact is these people were completely out of touch with what goes on in the real world. So that's where I'm from. I'm from the oil and gas business, second generation, and that's who I tend to hang around with. I've also done a lot of door knocking in my riding, and probably talked to over 1,000 people at the doors. And I don't know anybody that's just a dyed-in-the-wool Tory that can hardly wait to get out to the ballot box and keep the Tories in power for another term. I think the point is made, and it's well taken. I did some polling in my riding, and the largest single group, 60% of the people that responded were undecided. Now, of the people that did respond, over half said they would vote Wild Rose, but they tend to be a little more committed. But 60% are undecided, so it's going to be an interesting election. So I don't believe there's necessarily any love for renewing and extending the Tory mandate. I think it's going to be up to us as a party to tell us what we stand for and how we're going to be different other than just a different political party. Where will we take Alberta when given the opportunity?
Dwayne, one of the reasons we're talking about it here on an Ontario provincial television network is that you're going to have an election soon. Now, Premier Redford, when she was campaigning for her job in the leadership contest, did say that she believed in fixed election dates, and we have subsequently learned that what she meant was fixed election time.
Periods,
so, period. So she's promised to have the election sometime between March and May of this year, which isn't that far down the road. But do you think that kind of, I don't want to say backing away from the promise, but it's not as specific as it once was, is that hurting her?
I don't think so. I think I would have preferred a fixed election date. I think this is better than the old system where we could have had an election in the fall, we could have had an election in the spring, we could have waited as long as March of 2013. But at the same time, it did show a bit of a flip-flop. And there was a series of those that she's done since she became leader. First, she was going to cancel the fall legislative session. Then she had a legislative session and, in fact, pounded a lot of pieces of legislation through the fall. There was also, she promised a full judicial inquiry of the healthcare system, and instead she's backtracked on that. So there have been some of those, but the poll numbers haven't shown that. She's still quite popular. She's seen as not Ed Stelmach, which was always going to give her a bump. She's got a face to her own now by infusing funds into the education system. Through her drunk driving legislation that was controversial in some circles, popular in others, and we'll have to wait till the budget. So there has been some flip-flops, but so far her popularity has held up.
Okay, let me broaden the discussion with you, Jerry, a bit here, and I'm going to lay out a scenario, and I want you to tell me, well, you'll see where I'm going with this.
Okay.
October 2010, 2 major Canadian cities hold municipal elections. One of them elects a proudly redneck, law and order, we got to stop the gravy train, white Anglo-Saxon guy. The other city elects a Muslim, single, kind of cool, young, political, relatively neophyte guy. Which one got elected in Toronto and which one got elected in Calgary? And you see what I'm doing with this, right?
Well, absolutely. You're talking about Rob Ford in Toronto.
And Nahid Nenshi in Calgary.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
You would have assumed it would have been the other way around.
It seems counterintuitive.
Right.
But I think the reality is that, I think somebody said it earlier, most people are not really ideological. They're not really into politics, but they have values. They have things they care about. They care about keeping their income. They care about having their kids going to good schools and a clean environment, a good healthcare system. They care about the quality of their life. Other than that, they're non-ideological. And they're open to persuasion from the left or from the right. It depends on who puts forward the best campaign. It depends on who best frames the message so that it resonates with those people. In Toronto, that's what Ford did. He basically said, look, the elites are out of control. They're ruining the city. I'm about as unelite as you can get. Vote for me. And that resonated with it. Yes, supposedly liberal Toronto, it resonated there. And the same thing happened in Calgary. The candidate put forward a message that resonated with the people in that city. And this is what the Wild Rose people have to do. They have to say, it's not because we're conservative, vote for us, or we're right-wing, vote for us. They have to come up with a message that resonates with mainstream Albertans. And by the way, we saw that ad that you showed. I've written negative ads in the US and in Canada, and that's pretty weak. That's a pretty weak attack.
You mean soft, timid?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the least effective things you can call somebody is a flip-flopper. because it means they're right 50% of the time. So that's a pretty weak attack. If they're going to be serious and degrade Redford and her party, they got to get a little tougher than that.
Graham,
The problem with that.
So ahead, Graham, go ahead.
Okay, so the problem with that, the Tories are hoping that the Wild Rose goes negative, because negative tends to backfire in Alberta. We saw some, you may call them soft attack ads back in 2008 targeting Ed Stelmach, and they're by the unions, the building trades. They're kind of copying an ad campaign in Ontario that effectively attacked the Liberals. They brought it here to Alberta to attack Stelmach and the Tories, and it backfired. And so the Tories are actually hoping the Wild Rose goes negative, because they know that they could actually benefit from you know, a mean-spirited attack ads against Redford, because she is so popular right now.
Let me just share some stats a little bit more about Alberta as well here. Between the years 2001 and 2011, Alberta accounted for 21% of Canada's population growth. 1 in 6 Albertans was born outside of Canada. Alberta's got the youngest population in Canada, a median age of 35.8, 4 years younger than the national average. And Dwayne, right after Alison Redford won the PC leadership, as I think you folks in Calgary would call it, the Toronto Globe and Mail, but what the rest of us would call the Globe and Mail, ran a headline which said, "Alberta steps into the present," because they'd presumably elected a female premier at the leadership convention. What was your reaction to that headline?
Well, I wrote, first I sent a phone call to Josh Wingrove, who was the author of the article, and Josh got back at me and says, yes, but I didn't write the headline. Then I wrote a letter, and the Toronto Globe and Mail did publish it, basically saying, yes, Alberta has selected a female premier. Yes, the leader of the official opposition is a visible minority. Yes, the leader of the second most popular party in Alberta is also female. Yes, the mayor of our largest city is a visible minority and a Muslim. Perhaps Ontario could join Alberta in the present. And because it was just, the issue of Nenshi being a visible minority and a Muslim never came up during the election campaign. It only came up after he won, when the national media showed up to all of us hicks here in Calgary saying, I can't believe you elected a Muslim. It was never an issue. Redford never campaigned on being a female during the election, during her leadership race. Danielle Smith, who's also a very good speaker, very smart woman, doesn't campaign on being a woman. You know, the rest of the country needs to accept that Alberta is not what your image is. Yes, we dress up in cowboy hats. It's called the Stampede. 2 weeks later, we're back in suits.
Janet, do you want to pick up on that? Does the rest of the country need to figure out that Alberta, this is not your grandfather's Alberta anymore?
Well, yes, I think there are some really sort of old-fashioned stereotypes about Alberta. Every stereotype has some truth to it, but for the most part, you know, we are a young province, as you had said. There's a lot of progressive-minded people here. Fiscal conservatism is a very sort of fundamental value here in Alberta, but that doesn't mean that we're conservative in every way, shape, and form. You know, as Dwayne said, when Nenshi was elected as mayor of Calgary, his religion really didn't factor into it. His ethnicity really didn't factor into it. I remember the morning after the election, the national newspapers making a big deal out of the fact that we had elected a Muslim mayor, and a lot of people were saying to me, like, oh, is Nenshi Muslim? I didn't know. I didn't think about it. And so I think that's a thing about Alberta. We didn't sort of like, you know, rise to the occasion and elect these people because they were female or because they were ethnic. We elected them without really giving that any thought. And I think that's, you know, what people in Alberta would like people in Ontario to understand. You know, a lot of the stereotypes don't apply. You know, we're a young, progressive, outward-looking province, urban, very, very urban. I think we're a lot more urban than people outside of Alberta realize.
Graham, you're the one newspaper man here, so I should get you. I know you've had, no doubt, the situation in the past where somebody put a headline on a piece you wrote that you weren't totally thrilled with, but what did you think of that headline in the Globe and Mail?
Yeah, I found it very condescending, actually. But I felt bad for the reporter. It's a good story, and he said I didn't write the headline, of course. But I think that in some ways what was happening was the rest of Canada is catching up with Alberta politics to see what's actually happening here. Albertans like to vote conservative, small c conservative. And I think that, as Janet said, they like to be fiscal conservative, not socially conservative. And I think that what's happened in the past is that the Tories, the Conservative Party, has been in power for 40 years, but they tend to change leaders. And what they do, as opposed to the public changing government, what the PCs say to the public is, don't worry, we'll change for you. And so they get a new leader, like Alison Redford, then they change the caucus, and they usually change direction and policies. And I think that's what's happening here. The Conservatives are reinventing themselves in light of the province. And I think that, in fact, the rest of Canada is now catching up with where Alberta is.
Well, let's remind everybody in the province of Ontario what the seating is like in the province of Alberta's legislature, because we're, of course, accustomed here to having three very competitive parties, and in fact do have a minority legislature today. But in Alberta, it's been one party plus, basically, for 40 years. The Conservatives have 68 of the seats in the legislature, and look who's got the rest. The Liberals just 8, the Wild Rose 4, the NDP 2, and some relatively new faction called the Alberta Party that's got 1. Now, I guess, David, I should get you to comment on this first. I appreciate that as the guy who wants to be part of the Wild Rose government. Of course you think it's time for a change, and of course you think 40 years is enough. But I should get you to comment on this issue that Conservatives have very cleverly in the past changed leaders just in time to give the public the sense that major change was happening, and therefore they didn't need to change parties. Changing leaders was going to be adequate. Why do you think this time that's not enough?
Well, first of all, it's only happened once. This is not a routine event. There was the party was unpopular under Don Getty, and they had a leadership race. The Liberals at that time were running on a platform of fiscal responsibility. They changed to Klein. Klein won, and then everybody was happy, and they went in. So this is really only their second major attempt. The transition from Lougheed to Getty was fairly seamless, and the transition from Klein to Stelmach was seamless. Premier Redford is trying to convince us all that this is all about change. I think during her campaign, she promised everything but world peace, I think, but she was really out there on the hustings. As a matter of fact, when the cabinet minister resigned last week, you'll all help me with this, or the former cabinet minister, head of the Treasury Board, yeah, he was disappointed during the Tory leadership that everyone turned on the very government they were in. And so this is an interesting dynamic. For example, there's 66 MLAs, I believe, as of Friday, but 51 of them are running again, and so there's change, all right. And I guess what perplexes me is if you're the Minister of Justice in the legislature and you become the Premier and you go sort of one row down and 3 seats to the right or the left, where I don't know the seating, is that you can wake up and say we have a completely new government. I dispute that. I don't believe they do. And so Premier Redford's talking all about change, and I'm on the ballot saying, do you want faux change or do you want real change? And it'll be an interesting election.
Dwayne, what do you make of that argument?
That's the argument they have to make, because if you look at the planks of Wild Rose, they can't bash Ed Stelmach around anymore. He's gone. The royalty review has gone full circle, so that's gone. The transmission line issue seems to have been quieted down with public hearings that Redford's having. You know, their arguments now are the issue of change, which is the call that any opposition party is going to make, and the other is that there has to be some democratic renewal. And there are problems when you have a 40-year party. We're seeing a scandal brewing throughout the province with municipalities and provincial crown corporations and crown agencies donating money to the PC party. So far that hasn't resonated with the public as it has with others, but it's an example of the problems of 40 years of Tory rule. What Wild Rose has to do, and what the Liberals are going to try to do, and what the NDs are going to try to do, is try to say, all right, enough is enough, now we need full change. The question that the PCs are going to say is, we have changed, the party has changed, we're more centrist, we're more progressive, you know, some of the old guard, the Ron Leiparts, the Snellgroves, the Iris Evans, they're all gone, we've got a new group of people coming in. That's going to be the ballot question.
We talked earlier in the program about what the polls were saying, and you know, usually the polls can be helpful. I'm not sure that's the case this time, and I want to show 2 different polls that seem to be saying 2 very different things. Here's one that was in the National Post just a few days ago. It's got the Progressive Conservatives, that's Premier Redford's party, at 38%, the Wild Rose at 29%, so a very competitive race, then Liberals, NDs, and Alberta Party well down. However, if you go to Léger Marketing, which was published 2 days later, and we'll bring those numbers up now, it's got the Premier's party at 53%, the Wild Rose down at 16%, so a huge gap, and then once again the NDs, Liberals, and Alberta well behind again. Okay, Janet, Tell me how this makes any sense.
Well, you've got two polls conducted according to two very different methodologies. The poll that was in the National Post was what we call in the industry a demon dial poll. Automated calls were made. Press 1 if you're going to vote for the Conservatives, press 2 if you're going to vote for the Liberals. And that poll was done over one evening. The Leger poll, on the other hand, was done using sort of more traditional methods, live telephone operators. They conducted the poll over several nights, which meant people who weren't home the first night would have got a call the second night. So the first poll is maybe a reflection of people who were just sort of easy to get a hold of. The Leger poll is based on a methodology that's a little more sound. Leger does have a track record here in Alberta of getting election results correct. Forum, the company that conducted the National Post poll, is new to Alberta politics and doesn't have that track record. So I think there's methodological differences, and you can explain away the differences in the poll that way. But the critical thing here is both polls point to the same thing, and that is a lead by the PC government. And when you crunch those numbers, a large majority for the PC government, no matter which one of those polls is right.
Yeah, Jerry, would you have to conclude, based on a 37-point lead in the poll that seems to be more trustworthy than the other one, that's a pretty good place to be if you're the Premier trying to show change, listening, I'm the change you want, etc.?
No,
Well,
not at all. Not at all. No.
No, you're not buying?
I like that position that the Wild Rose Alliance.
You like being 37 points behind 2 months before an election?
Because here's how I frame the message. They've peaked. They can't get any higher than they are right now. We got no place to go but up. And as the campaign progresses, as people become more focused on the issues, I expect that the Tories will fall and the Wild Rose Party will increase. And then you say, aha, I told you, we have momentum going into this election. We're the party that's growing. We're the party that you want to be part of because we have momentum. And momentum is an important thing in politics. And just claiming you have it can sometimes give it to you. So yeah, if I'm of the Wild Rose Party, I'm not discouraged by those numbers. I embrace them.
Well, let me ask David Yeager. Are you embracing or discouraged by being at 16 points in that Leger poll?
I think that Leger poll had 900 people, and in the first week of January, I hired some people to do some voter identification and telephone marketing in my riding, and there was 17,000 phone calls made, or 15,000 phone calls, 1,700 people talked to. And so I don't know. Janet's the expert on this. I listen to her on the radio all the time. Again, if you want an oil well drilled, that's probably my strong suit. I'm learning politics. But maybe in Royal Oak. But that's a bad joke. But anyway, so I look at the stats that I got, and it was congruent with what I see at the door. I've been ringing doorbells now for 4 months. I go to the door. I'm Dave with Wild Rose. And I see something completely different. I find the response at the door is 90% of the people have heard of the party. 1 out of 8 says, get off my property or I'll get the 12 gauge. So I don't know who they are. I did run into one woman who worked with Alison Redford's sister. So she apologized and said, I got to vote for the Premier. Twice as many of the people I talked to at the door. And the number of people I've talked to at the door is greater than, now maybe this is just a snapshot of one riding in Calgary, but the number of people I've talked to is greater than the number polled in either of the polls referred. And twice as many as say, get out of here, say, yes, I'm going to vote Wild Rose, I'm glad you came. And then there's this massive pool of undecided. And so when I talk about the number one issue in my riding is healthcare. And I say, well, they've had 40 years to fix healthcare. If they have the solution, I'm ready. Are you ready? And the voters at the door say, I'm ready. I say, well, good, we're both ready. I said, well, maybe they don't know what they're doing. And so I like to comment that we've got an uphill fight to climb. I don't disagree with anything you said about what we have to do as a party. But in terms of where I work, who I talk to, and the people I talk to, I'm much more optimistic about how we're going to do in that election than either of those polls should leave me to be.
Graham, I know that the polls are supposed to be scientifically done. Having said that, sometimes I trust the nose of a political reporter who's seen this movie before better than I trust any single snapshot at a moment in history. So your nose, I think, is pretty trustworthy. Does it feel like a 37-point lead for the government right now?
I would say right now, yeah, they're doing really well. I think that those polls, the Leger poll seems to be a bit more credible than the other poll, the Forum poll. Having said that, I'm hoping as a journalist, as a columnist, that the election campaign will be much more interesting than these polls would suggest. Because we tend to have really boring election campaigns in Alberta where one party runs away with it. Ralph Klein, as Premier, used to promise boring election campaigns, and boy, he delivered boring campaigns. So did Ed Stelmach. I'm really hoping, for the sake of journalism, for the sake of democracy, that we do have a lot more of an interesting election campaign, a closer election campaign than the polls are saying right now. But I think that these polls right now are accurate.
Graham, do you think there's any possibility that one of those lesser parties, like the NDP, the Liberals, or the Alberta Party, can win anything more than, say, 4, 5, 6 seats?
I think right now the party, those three parties you've mentioned, I think the one that may have the best chance of doing better is the NDP, especially in Edmonton, because they're doing quite well. And also they have put themselves out as sort of being different on the political landscape, as being the one that would potentially raise taxes, be a tighter grip on the oil sands. And they're trying to be different on the spectrum, whereas I think that the Liberals could be in real trouble. They've got a new leader, but they don't seem to be doing very well in the polls. They're not really connecting with Albertans. So the Liberals, who are now the official opposition, it would seem would be likely replaced by the Wild Rose Alliance, which will make things more interesting. But I think that right now the NDP is the one party that may be a big surprise election night.
Okay, Dwayne, help us out with this, because I know of all the numbers we've put on the table so far during this discussion, the one that I suspect catches the eye of most of our viewers is the fact that this petro state is running a $3 billion plus deficit. How do you have record revenues, have all the oil in North America, and run a $3 billion deficit? What's going on there?
Well, there's a couple. You need to put an asterisk by that deficit. The Stelmach government had put aside, and so had Klein, a sustainability fund. So they've been using that sustainability fund to pay off the deficit. So it's not like they're borrowing money to do that. The other is that they've dropped revenues, right? There is no sales tax in Alberta. One of the things that Stelmach did is he got rid of healthcare premiums. That took $1 billion out of the budget. So they've dropped taxes. And that's where the problem has come. The other issue is natural gas prices. Natural gas prices are now below $2 a gigajoule. The royalties that the Alberta government gets from natural gas is much higher than it is from oil. So it's the drop in natural gas resource revenue. But this is the major plank of Wild Rose, and this will be another test in the election. When the budget comes down, which is February 9th, if they show another $3 billion deficit, that's going to really help Wild Rose in the election. If, on the other hand, it's much lower than that, or perhaps even balanced, then the calculations are all off the mark. So it's a self-imposed deficit because the government does not want to tax Albertans more.
Janet, when you do polling on this issue, do Albertans mind the fact that there's a $3 billion deficit nowadays?
Well, it's interesting. I did some polling recently, and what I found out was that Albertans fall into two basic camps. And it divides about 50-50 in the population. One camp is, this is Alberta, we have a lot of money, we're fiscally conservative, we should not run a deficit under any condition, I want a balanced budget. And then there's another group that says, I want a balanced budget, we shouldn't run a deficit, but I will accept a deficit if the alternative to that is cuts to core services like health and education. And that's essentially the drama that's playing out between the Wild Rose and the Conservatives right now. The Wild Rose voters are turning out to be those people who staunchly argue the idea that we shouldn't have a deficit under any circumstances. And other voters who sort of are willing to accept a deficit, particularly when it's funded by the Sustainability Fund, they're willing to accept a deficit if it means sort of sustainability in our public services. And that's really where Albertans are at right now. Fundamentally fiscally conservative. It's just when and how we'll accept a budget, we'll accept a deficit in the budget is what sort of is the line in the sand between Albertans.
Gotcha. Got about 3 minutes left here, Jerry. I want to put one more thing on the table. The Prime Minister, this is his home province.
Right.
I know he was born here, but this is what he represents now. He's put the directive out to all of his federal MPs that they are to lay off this campaign. He doesn't want them supporting either the Conservatives or the Wild Rose. It's a provincial event. We're not going to be a part of it. Can you enforce that? If you're the PM, is that wise to try to enforce that?
Well, if I'm a member of Parliament, I do not want to get on Stephen Harper's bad side. It's not a good idea for your career. So I think he can enforce it, and I think his reasoning is, I don't want to take sides because either one of them could win, and I want to have good relationships with whoever ends up premier. I think he can work very well with Redford. He's probably more ideologically in tune with Daniel Smith. They sort of come from the same Reform sort of Canadian Alliance background. But he can work with either one of them, and I don't think he wants to take the chance of sort of alienating either one of them.
David Yeager, let me get you to follow up on that, because I wonder how disappointed you were to hear that while Harper's former advisor Tom Flanagan is giving significant assistance to your Wild Rose campaign. None of the other MPs in Alberta is going to be allowed to do so.
Oh, I think the federal-provincial line's fairly well drawn. I think you have to be fairly careful here. It used to be a good blood sport. Picking on Ottawa was a sure way to get votes if you go back to that level. So I think the Prime Minister has a national agenda, and this is a provincial issue. I think you're right. The summation that philosophically they're on the same lines, but that would be highly unusual for the federal people to get involved in a provincial campaign in Alberta. I think so anyway. Just before we leave the fiscal issue, though, Janet's summation. In about 1978, we established the Heritage Fund and piled up $15 billion, and whatever that is, 42 years later, or 32 years later, that's really all we have. During the last boom, in the first half of the last decade, we piled up the Sustainability Fund, and the deficit will walk through that. This is sort of the 5th straight year of deficit. So she's absolutely right in the sense that the deficit hasn't cost anybody anything, in the sense we're just piling up past savings. But an issue has become, and you hear it all the time if you do talk financial matters, how come Norway has several $100 billion and Alberta has 15? And so this goes back to the fiscal aspects. This will all come out during the campaign, is where is the money. But at some point, these paths are going to cross. This is the 5th consecutive year of government deficits with oil at $100 a barrel. You can talk about the price of gas being down, but that may be somewhat permanent. The price of gas, because of shale gas North America-wide, may never come back. So at some point or another, I think when the throne speech is read and the budget is delivered, whatever is going to be in it, let's do another poll. Let's see what we've got to look forward to.
And we in the province of Ontario look forward to watching your election, whether it takes place in March, April, or May. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Graham Thompson from the Edmonton Journal, Janet Brown from Janet Brown Consulting, Dwayne Bratt from Mount Royal University, David Yeager, the Wild Rose Party candidate, and Jerry Nichols here in our Toronto studios. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good evening.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.